We are pleased tonight to have a new AAFRC member, Bill Neff, who's been a high school friend of John's, what, 20 years ago or something? He came last month to the meeting for the first time and joined and graciously said he would come in and speak tonight. Bill will speak on the time when he served in the Navy on active duty from April 1960 until February 24th, 1964. He remained in the inactive reserve until October 1966, when he was selected to attend Naval Aviation OCS. Due to a medical issue, he was discharged with his rank at Retirement Aviation Fire Control Technician, 2nd Class E5. Bill enlisted in the Air National Guard in December '73 and started at his prior service E5 grade, which translated into the Air Force rank of Staff Sergeant. Thus, we have the Navy Air Force flags behind us tonight. Where am I? He advanced to technical sergeant in 1979 and then went to the Air Guard OCS, retiring in July '94 with the permanent rank of Lieutenant Colonel 05. Bill will discuss his shift from the U.S. Navy to the Air National Guard with an interesting and amusing story of his many attempts to become a commissioned officer. In addition, he will offer a picture of how the Connecticut Air National Guard grew from what some people referred to as a flying club to a true partner to the USAF Total Force concept. He will discuss the transition Connecticut made from the F-100D fighter bomber to the now famous A-10A Thunderbolt II, more commonly known as the Warthog. In conjunction with the talk about the transition, he will offer some facts about the A-10A as well as some anecdotal comments about this interesting aircraft. Before his retirement in 2001, Bill was director of Reinsurance Group Life Underwriting at Cigna in Bloomfield and retired in '96 after 27 years of service. The Hartford then hired him to start them in the life reinsurance business, and he was their director of Group Life Underwriting. Not a great job, I know, I'm in that business. Anyway, Bill, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Unaccustomed to this, okay? Louder. Always a good way to start. I brought a track to run on because I certainly couldn't memorize the whole thing. I was back there somewhere, but I don't always drag it forward when I want to. But my speech was how I went from being a North American white hat sailor to an air guard type. And some people say it's not possible. Over the years, I've met quite a few people who served in several branches of the service. There were sailors who became ex-Marines, soldiers who became airmen, and so on. When I was in the Navy, I never dreamed that I would become an Air Force type, but it did happen. For those who don't know me, I should mention my tie to Cheshire. My dad was from Waterbury. He became a doctor and he interned at Waterbury Hospital, where he met my mother. My mom was from New Bedford, Mass, and she was a nurse anesthetist at the hospital. Long story short, they met, they married, and decided to settle in Cheshire. In 1935, my parents established their home in Dad's medical office in an unused church parsonage on Main Street. As a side note, Dad's first patient was young Herb Coleman, who later became our longtime postmaster. My sister was born in 1936, and I came along in 1939. In early 1941, my folks were told that they would have to leave the parsonage because a new minister was coming to town. They were able to buy the old house at 93 Main Street, and that was to be my home until I went off to college. I had an elementary education at Humiston School right on Main Street in Cheshire, and then graduated from Cheshire High School in the class of 1957. And our chaplain, my friend John White, was a classmate, and he still is my good friend. My father wanted me to follow in his footsteps. He went to Columbia in New York City, and so when I graduated from Cheshire High, I applied, was accepted, and I was off to New York City in the fall of 1957. It was exciting to go to school in New York City. However, I really had never learned how to study, at least to the extent called upon by Columbia. And as the semesters rolled on, my grade point went ever lower. I certainly didn't want to fail in obtaining a degree, but I think I needed to do some growing up in order to deal with the sort of educational challenge that I had. I talked with the dean and with my dad, and my dad asked, had you ever thought about going into the military? And I admitted that that's about all I could think about at that time. He asked what branch, and I said, I thought about the Marine Corps. Now, I have to mention that my dad took a commission as a doctor in the Naval Reserve in 1936. He never even had a uniform until he was called to active duty in June of 1941. And then, of course, the war came along, and you know what happened then. He was assigned to the Fleet Marine Force, and he went on to see combat on Guadalcanal in 1942, and was in the first wave which landed on Cape Gloucester, New Britain in 1943. He then came back to Connecticut, and he was assigned as the medical officer at the recruiting station in New Haven, so he was able to commute. He was very proud of the fact that he had served as commander of the medical company in the famous Chesty Puller's 7th Regiment, 1st Marine Division. Nevertheless, when I said I was thinking of joining the Marines, he reminded me of his combat experience and told me that if I tried to join the Corps, he was going to send me to a psychiatrist. It sounded like good advice, so I withdrew from Columbia and joined the Navy. Now, I added a little bit here that I thought I would put in because those of you who are veterans would appreciate my first brush with military bureaucracy. I went downtown in New York City to the recruiting office and took the multiple choice, or we used to call it the multiple guess test, to find out if I qualified to join the Navy. The petty officer at the desk said, "Well, mate," and that sounded very salty to me. "Well, mate," he said, "you pretty much aced the exam." He said, "You can do most any job you want in the Navy. What do you want to do?" And I said, I thought I wanted to do naval air. He said there was a program called ARHS. If you were a high school graduate, you could get a guaranteed job in any of the Navy specialties in aviation. He asked, was I a high school graduate? I told him I'm a junior in college. He repeated, are you a high school graduate? I replied that I was a junior at Columbia University in uptown New York, and I thought that would really get him. He asked, do you have a high school diploma? I said, I do, and it's in Cheshire, Connecticut. So long story short, I had to go back to Cheshire and get my Cheshire high school diploma and drag it back to New York before they'd make me into an airman recruit in the U.S. Navy. Welcome to the Navy. This isn't a Navy talk primarily, but I have to cover a few highlights to give you some background. I went to boot camp in Illinois at Great Lakes, and about a year of electronics training in Memphis, Tennessee. In Millington, actually. I graduated as an aviation fire control technician with a fighter plane specialty. And for those of you who aren't familiar with, fire control doesn't mean I was a fireman. It meant that I took care of the radar and missile control systems in fighter planes. I was assigned to Fighter Squadron VF-114 at Miramar Naval Air Station in San Diego. It's now a Marine base, by the way. It was the first, we in VF-114 were the first West Coast operational squadron to receive the new supersonic F-4B Phantom II fighter. We were part of Air Group 11, which was assigned to serve on the then brand new aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk, and it was exciting work. During the next 2.5 years, I took part in 2 Western Pacific cruises on the Kitty Hawk and visited many exciting ports of call. It was the Cold War, or peacetime cruising as we called it. We played cat and mouse with Russian spy ships and Russian bombers. And despite the fact that we weren't at war, over my 2.5 years of sea duty, over 6 people attached to the Kitty Hawk were killed. Various types of accidents. I quickly learned that the flight deck was a pretty dangerous way to make a buck. I mentioned to a couple of the gents early on, you may remember there was a Navy ad back in the 1960s which said, "The Navy. It's not just a job, it's an adventure." We in the fleet had a version which said, "It's not just an adventure, it's $89 a month." True. Most importantly, soon after I arrived at NAS Miramar, I crashed a party in San Diego, met a pretty young woman with a cute turned-up nose named Elizabeth. We courted and became engaged, and after my 1964 release from active duty, we came back east and were married. And we just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary in May.
And Liz is sitting in back.
She's there. When I enlisted, I promised my folks and myself that I would finish college, preferably at Columbia. During my last cruise, I wrote to Columbia, and they asked for details of what I had done in serving in the Navy. They also wanted a letter about me from one of my officers. I sent a letter outlining my path from airman airman recruit to second-class petty officer, and one of my officers, Lieutenant J.G. Kirk Sheehan, wrote to Columbia and gave them a glowing report about me. You would think that I walked on water and didn't get the bottoms of my feet wet. As a side note, I always wondered what had happened to this fine young radar intercept officer. During the 1980s, I got an issue of the Tailbook magazine, which featured an article about my old squadron, the F-114. I was saddened to read that not many months after writing that fine letter to Columbia, he was killed while ejecting from an aircraft doing a routine maintenance test flight. His body was never recovered. I was welcomed back to Columbia in June of 1964 during summer school, which started right after our marriage. I earned grades which showed that I was there to succeed at last. I heaped on the courses, which included courses in both summers that I was there, and qualified for my BA degree and graduated in January of 1966. During my last semester, I received literature about a non-flying commission in the Navy. I thought I might get myself a Navy career. My wife supported me in this effort. I applied and was accepted, and in October 1966, I reported to Pensacola for Aviation Officer Candidate School. I was slated to be a non-flying air intelligence officer. I lasted about 3 days. Although we had been given cursory physicals when we applied for OCS, I went through Floyd Bennett Naval Air Station in New York. We were now all given extensive 3-day physicals. The last stop for me was the ear, nose, and throat clinic. A flight surgeon took a look at my right ear and called for the captain in charge to take a look. He determined that I had a chronic ear infection, and in fact, part of the eardrum had actually sloughed off. He said, "Son," I said, "I'm afraid that's the end of you in the Navy." Findings were sent to the Bureau of Medicine, and the end result was that I received a medical discharge. I appealed the decision when I got back to Connecticut, but the VA said they confirmed the findings, and at that juncture, there was nothing much they could do to help me. They gave me a 10% disability and sent me on my way. Now, if we fast forward to 1970, I had a flare-up of the infection in the right ear, and I was sent on disability. Because I was on disability, my doctor in Avon sent me to the local VA hospital. They had an ENT surgeon who said he knew a new procedure called a tympanoplasty, where they take a piece of dura from your skull and they make it into a new eardrum. They graft it in place. And bottom line, he operated. It was a success, and 2 years later, they told me the disability was to be removed, and I was once again 1A. Now, I had 2 children and a career in the reinsurance business, but I called the Naval Reserve in Connecticut to see if I could take advantage of the time that I had served and join the Naval Reserve. The first thing they told me was that there's no naval aviation within a reasonable distance of Connecticut. The Weymouth base had been closed. And they told me that since I'd been out of the Navy since 1966, if they took me back in, I could only go in as an E3, which would be a seaman. They wanted me to become a mine man in the surface fleet. Going back to E3 and messing with mines didn't ring my chimes. However, about that time, my wife and I took the kids to an air show at Bradley Field, which featured the Thunderbirds. My son picked up all sorts of literature, including Air National Guard literature, and a program for prior service aviation types stood out to me. Bottom line, I went to the Air Guard and reviewed their options. They offered me a 1-year enlistment in my old pay grade because I had been in aviation type prior service. Since their F-100Ds didn't have fire control radar, I was offered a slot as a munitions technician. I accepted and I enlisted. I was now a staff sergeant in training to be a load crew leader. They also told me that although there weren't any openings for officer billets at that time, since I had a college degree, I would be eligible to apply if an opening developed. As much as I loved airplanes and I knew very little about the Air Force, I knew absolutely nothing about the Air National Guard. However, since I was now a staff sergeant, it was time for on-the-job training. I soon find that I arrived at a rather timely transition with the Connecticut Air National Guard. There are full-time members in the Air Guard, for those who don't know much about the Guard, but I was to be a typical weekend warrior. In other words, I had to drill 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks of active duty a year. Now, I'll give you just a brief history of the Air Guard. Because, again, a lot of you know the Army Guard, but are not familiar with the Air Guard. Actually, the Connecticut unit dates back to World War I. They had their 80th anniversary in 1998, as a matter of fact. Essentially, it was part of the Army Guard, and originally they were at Brainerd Field over in Hartford. It evolved from trainers and a long series of observation planes during the 20s and 30s, but then in 1941, they were called to active duty. When Pearl Harbor occurred, the unit, most of the people from the Connecticut unit were sent over to Southeast Asia and became part of what was, prior to that, the Flying Tigers. The 118th Observation Squadron flew P-51s, and they were very successful in Southeast Asia. After World War II, the Connecticut Air Guard flew a succession of second-hand airplanes, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51, and related support aircraft. Old-timers used to tell stories about that time. Lots of buzzing of hometowns. We saw that in Cheshire. One of my father's patients was a pilot, and it buzzed the town. And during 2 weeks of summer camp, reportedly, the beer flowed like water. I only know what the big boys at the pool hall tell me, so I don't know if that's true. In 1947, after the Air Force was established as a separate part of the U.S. military establishment, Connecticut received a succession of jets. And again, they were second-hand. The F-84 Thunderjet, the F-94 Starfires, and the early F-100A Super Sabre were part of some of the planes they flew. During the Korean War, the Connecticut Air Guard was called to active duty, but they spent most of their time towing aerial targets for the regular Air Force on Long Island. The Air Guard was somewhat of a country cousin to the regular Air Force. Earlier I mentioned they thought of it as kind of a flying club. The state name, instead of U.S. Air Force, was painted on our airplanes. However, in 1960, Connecticut Air Guard was selected to receive F-102A Delta Daggers, an interceptor that became part of the Air Defense Command. They were tasked with standing alert for any aircraft attempting to enter U.S. airspace. The days of the flying club were ending, and Connecticut's unit, along with many other state Air Guard units, were moving towards a more active role with the United States Air Force. As a side note, my old maintenance squadron commander, Marty Cornelio, now lives in Avon. We had lunch together, and recently he told me a story that I thought you'd appreciate. Although I never worked with the F-102, aircraft on board search with onboard search and radar and attack radar and guided to air-to-air missiles was something new to our unit, and most of the pilots were initially low on the learning curve with it. And the same thing was true of the enlisted fire control technicians. One day, one of the pilots returned from a training flight at Bradley Field and made the following entry in the Form 81A, which is like a logbook that goes with each airplane. In the section which asked about any malfunction, the pilot simply entered, "Radar went ape." The aircraft was turned over to fire control for evaluation, and if needed, corrective action occurred. A bit later, the commander of operations stormed into the maintenance commander's office, and the commander of operations said to the maintenance commander that, "What can I do for you?" And he said, "Well, in corrective action section, Under radar went ape. The corrective action read, remove monkey from cockpit. I gather there was a lot of yelling and screaming and threats, but it eventually blew over. I wasn't in the unit when they flew F-102s. However, many of the old-timers in maintenance told me that it wasn't a popular airplane, both in the eyes of the maintainers and then the pilots. Now we got into a transition to the F-102, F-100, I should say. Now the F-100 was an aircraft that we had seen before in the A model in the 50s, but it entered the service of our country as a ground attack aircraft. We generally call them mud movers. Mud movers with bombs supported the troops. It's a swept wing aircraft, 50-foot wing length, about a wingspan of 38 feet, but of course it was swept. It had a power plant from Pratt & Whitney, the famous J-57, had a thrust normally of 10,000 pounds with a 17,000 pounds thrust with afterburner. Had a maximum speed of 864 miles per hour. One of the things that struck me as unique, because I had always worked with the Phantom, which had missiles, is that the F-100 had cannons, 4 20-millimeter M39 cannons. I thought I would do a little show and tell and give you some idea of what we were dealing with. In World War I, the weapon of choice for aerial combat was a .30 caliber. Now these are empty cartridges for all of those who may feel that Neff they have to go get the mental security and these got bullets in place, but not so. Empty cartridges. This is .30 caliber. It was big in World War I, through the 30s, and even in World War II. For instance, the famous Spitfire and Hurricanes that the British flew had .30 caliber machine guns, 8 each, in the wings of these birds. During World War I, however, Browning developed the famous 50 caliber Mark II, the Ma Deuce. Now, as you can see when you look at the difference, we're talking a lot bigger projectile, a lot bigger bullet. And this was the standard through World War II, well into Korea. As a matter of fact, the famous F-86 Sabre jets that shot down all the MiGs in Korea used the 50 caliber Ma Deuce machine gun. They varied in speed. The .30 calibers, maybe 500 or 600 rounds per minute. The 50 caliber, based on modifications, could go all the way up to 800 rounds per minute. But they started messing around with cannon during the Korean War, and the Navy used them very extensively. During the 1950s, General Motors division of Pontiac developed the M39 cannon, which had a revolving magazine. It was very interesting. Kind of like the revolving magazine you see on a Colt peacemaker revolver. We went from 50 caliber to 20 millimeter. Now these are made out of solid steel. These are the rounds that we use to train with up at Bradley, so don't worry about it being explosive. But we would carry, each cannon on the F-100D had about 200 to 240 rounds of 20 millimeter. It was available in an armor-piercing round, a high explosive, or target practice. I happen to have one that a round broke apart in one of our F-100s one day when I was de-arming it, so I helped myself to the projectile. It's just solid steel. It was used for target practice. And afterwards, you can come up and heft it and see that if you get tagged with one of these Hummers, you're in a world of hurt. That's a tough deal. They were all linked together. It was called a link-fed weapon. And it would come out of the chute. The rounds would be pushed out of these spring steel links into the cannon. It would fire the brass from the empty cartridge and go overboard and dump into the ground. The links went into a bay on the aircraft where it would unload them after the flight. It was kind of a cross between the old and the new. It was electrically fired in the F-100D, but before the plane was launched, we had to take down the gun bay doors and cock them by hand. I'm not a very big person, so I used to have to put my whole body into it, but some of the bigger guys could just do this and they were ready to go. And then when the airplane would return from a fighter or bombing mission, the first thing that happened on the ground was that we'd take down the gun bay doors and take the leads off the guns to save them. So the F-100 was there. It gave us a more modern aircraft. It was really altogether new to me because it had the 20mm cannon. The popular name for the F-100 was the Hun. It was the first of the 100 series fighter planes. People who worked around it used to call it the lead sled. It had a glide ratio a little bit like a brick, and if you lost your power, it was time to go bye-bye. Not long after we got the F-100D, in the mid-70s, we had an Air Force advisor join us. Every guard unit has a regular Air Force officer as the advisor, and he's a liaison to the Air Force. We got a Lieutenant Colonel Salter, who was a real nice man. He had flown combat in Vietnam flying Phantoms, but he had to downgrade and learn how to fly the F-100 before he joined us. One day he went up with a flight of 4 to a bombing range on the old island of No Man's Land, which is off of Martha's Vineyard. It was used as a bombing range for decades. The 4 planes were doing simulated attacks. He did a diving strafing run on No Man's Land. I guess maybe the sink rate of the aircraft got the best of him. He bellied in and was killed. And it was a sad day for the Connecticut Guard because he was a true gentleman. Now we get back to my track to run on. At the end of the Vietnam era, the Air Force started doing a lot of research into the whole business of ground attack. They didn't really like the mission. The higher-ups in the Air Force felt that their role should be providing fighter attack and protection for the bombers. And despite the fact that in World War II, the Air Force was extremely successful with ground attack, especially in Europe. They had P-47 Thunderbolts that laid waste to German armor throughout Europe. And they were very good at it. The close air support between the infantry and the Air Force was exemplary. In Korea, they were trying to do the very same thing, but they are now into jets, and the problem with jets is that they move very fast, and the pilot has difficulty getting a good fixation on the target. Not only that, but they found out during the Vietnam War that low-flying jets were a target for everybody that had a machine gun or a rifle in his hand, and the United States lost a tremendous number of ground attack aircraft, a lot of them F-100s, during the Vietnam War. They decided that even though they didn't like the mission of ground attack, there are books that discuss the fact that they did all kinds of research, and out of it came the A-10. The A-10 is what we decided to get, or were assigned in the early part of 1979. Now, many of you have probably seen the A-10s flying over. When I used to march in the Memorial Day parades, and those Hummers would come over at about a 400-foot altitude, it was very effective. The sound of freedom, we used to call it. But this is an airplane that was really built upon the research needed to do effective ground attack. There are a lot of things about it that I can discuss, really. It has twin engines, twin tail. It's part of the redundancy of the airplane. It had a 30mm cannon, which I'll get into in a minute, and it's really strange because the cannon is right on the center line of the aircraft. If the landing gear's down, you'll see the landing gear is off to the side. In other words, the cannon was more important than the landing gear in position. It had 11 sights to hang weapons. Now, the F-100 had 6 different sights, but 2 of them were generally filled with fuel tanks. So we really only had 2 pylons on each wing to use for bombs or rockets. This proud beauty had 11 sights, and you could hang about everything but the kitchen sink on it. When it was fully loaded, the aircraft weighed some 50,000 pounds, and which was about a third heavier than the F-100 fully loaded. A couple of other things about it. Of course, I mentioned the cannon. And the cannon was, if pilots didn't initially like the F-100, they sure loved the cannon. It was created by General Electric, and it was fully 19 feet long from the muzzle back into the fuselage where the ammunition drone was. Going back to my show and tell, we saw the 20 millimeter that the F-100D had, and now we have the 30 millimeter empty cartridge case used by the GAU 8 cannon.
I thought it was a beer stein.
Well, I suppose if you got desperate enough, you could do it. We found that it had a maximum capacity of about 1,300 rounds, but they didn't always carry that many because it would be subject to jams if it was fully loaded. On the other hand, it had 2 cycle rates. Machine guns, maybe 600 or 700 rounds per minute, rat-tat-tat-tat. The Mark 39 20 millimeter, 1,500 rounds per minute, and it was kind of a buzzing sound when it fired. This baby, the low rate was about 2,000 rounds a minute, and the high rate was about 3,900 rounds per minute. The bullet is coming out of the muzzle at almost 4,000 feet per second. So they didn't have tracers. The pilot did not need tracers. He would just see the bullet striking the target, and he could move his sights and his aircraft to meet that need. When it fired, it caused a tremendous blast of gun gas, and that led to another big problem because planes started to flame out. If they fired the gun too long and all of this gun gas came up over into the intakes, all of a sudden the gun gas won't support combustion of the jet engine and it would flame out. So they went through all kinds of weird looking arrangements to have the gas bent downwards. One of them was a big object on the tip of on the barrel that would turn with the gun. It's a 7-barrel Gatling gun, but it would get out of sync weight-wise and cause tremendous cracks in the trunnions of the cannon. They eventually solved the problem by changing the powder mixture, and so they had a weapon that could fire up to almost 4,000 rounds per minute. It carried about 1,300 rounds of ammunition, so you realize that the tiniest little blip of the trigger would tickle off about 7 or 8 rounds, 70 or 80 rounds. It was devastating. I had one chance when I was on active duty out in Arizona. I catched a ride in an F1 in a O2 observation plane, and we flew out to the range and watched a bunch of Connecticut Air National Guard planes beat up on old trucks and airplanes. It was a bombing range. They came in so low over the ground that there were rooster tails of dust going behind the plane. They'd come to a cactus and they had to go over it. Another thing the pilots had to learn is that they were flying so close to the ground, they call that in the weeds, that they had to pitch up before they banked, because if they banked at that altitude, they'd put a wing in the ground and that was the end of the flight. So they'd pitch up, turn, and then come back down. We were watching them coming over the desert, dragging dust. They'd pop up about 1,500 feet, come in on a target, pickle off a bunch of rounds and destroy whatever it hit, and then back down in the weeds again. It was an amazing thing to watch. I was privileged to see it. And with all those various pylons, they carried smart bombs, gun bombs, rockets, ECM pods, you name it, it would carry it. And even though it's fighting for its very existence in Congress, it's still with us today. Another couple of things that I thought I'd mention that are interesting, it's got armored components, including the pilot. He's sitting in kind of a titanium bathtub, which is 30 millimeters thick. Other key components of the aircraft are armor plated. It's redundant because it has twin tails. I have pictures of a plane over in Iraq that had one of the vertical fins shot off. The pilot made it back. There's a woman pilot, as a matter of fact. Came back on the other rudder. One engine is crushed. The other one's going to carry it along. It's not fast. There's an old saying with the fighter community that speed is life. Well, there wasn't any life in the speed of this airplane, but you did have armor and weapons. And I think every time I hear the Congress talking about getting rid of the A-10, I sympathize with the soldiers and the Marines on the ground, because I know I've read so many stories that when they hear the A-10s are over them, they know that they're going to be safe. at least as safe as they can be. Because in one of the magazine articles they have saying that the bad guys hear the sound of this airplane and their bowels turn to water. And I think, having seen what the thing can do, I'm not at all surprised. There's another little interesting thing there. It's operating so low to the ground that it's hard for the enemy gunners to tell which way it's banking. On the bottom of the A-10s, they have a gray oval, which looks like the cockpit. And so it's designed to confuse the gunners as to whether it's banking this way or that way. Kind of clever. It has self-sealing tanks that are specially explosive resistant. It has chaff flare dispensers on the wingtips and at the end of the wheel nacelles. It dumps out these little chaff bundles, little square cartridges, which are effectively little strands of aluminum foil, and that foxes enemy radar. In the same token, they also dump out these little flares, which are very high intensity magnesium, and those bright flares are supposed to head heat-seeking missiles away from the aircraft. So sometimes in the news you'll see pictures of F-16s or A-10s diving into attack, and all of a sudden all these bright flashes appear behind them. That's the chaff flare dispensers. It has redundant controls, as I say, armor plating. It's capable of operating from unimproved strips. It has very rugged landing gear. It has single-point refueling in the center on the front of this nacelle. You open it up, you hook a pressurized fuel line to it, and all the tanks of the airplane are filled from that one source. So the crew chief or the fuel tech doesn't have to go from tank to tank the way they did in World War II or Korea. One point. And then in front of the cockpit, there's a hatch that moves down, and it can be refueled in air from a tanker aircraft. Many times these planes over Iraq and Afghanistan have been airborne for 8 or 10 hours. And they get air-to-air refueling. But if the need is to provide defense to a given unit, they're up there. I gather that seat gets very hard after a while. And then lastly, one of the really interesting things, and we'll get to it in just a second, is the stabilized ejection seat. It has a gyro-stabilized ejection seat. Now, in the first years of ejection seats, the airplane had to be at altitude and it had to be moving rather quickly before the pilot could eject safely. As the years went by, they developed what they call zero-zero ejection seats. In other words, if the plane was sitting on the ramp and caught fire, the pilot could eject, it would go high enough for the parachute to deploy, and he'd have a chance at survival. With this particular seat, which is gyro-stabilized, if the airplane is banking and the pilot has to punch out for whatever reason, the seat will come out and stability comes in and it'll go straight up, no matter what his attitude is. Of course, if he's inverted, that's another story. But if in any kind of a weird attitude, when he ejects, he goes up. And then the chute deploys at a given altitude. And of course, it goes without saying, it's a highly maneuverable aircraft. Not fast, but maneuverable. I've seen it, and it's amazing to watch this goofy thing fly. It really is. About this time, we were starting to get, in the F-100D, we were getting away from the flying club, as I mentioned. We were getting into deployments away from the base, and now deployments into Europe, and even we went on one 5 or 6 weeker to Hawaii to work with the Army over there. We were assigned what they call checker flag locations. This is during the days of the Red Menace. Our checker flag location with the F-100s was a little air base in Great Britain, which I went on one deployment there. And then when we moved into the A-10, our checker flag location was at a German Navy air base up in the north towards Cuxhaven called NAS Nordholz. We were there for 2 weeks, and I was introduced to Oktoberfest. And I found that 1 or 2 beers is as much as you can deal with. It's quite a place. An Air Force officer came in and said, this was before unification, there are 620 breweries in Germany. and not one of them makes a bad beer. And we had sergeants who were trying to see if they could do all 6 of them. I don't think they succeeded. Early on, we found that although we were converting to the F-100, from the F-100 to the A-10, it wasn't all that easy. The pilots took a look at the mission, and we had several pilots decide they didn't want to fly the A-10, so they left the unit. It wasn't that popular with some. The A-10 may have had protective armor and huge weapons capability, as I've mentioned, but the speed wasn't great, and a lot of them were the old time that said you got to have speed to stay alive. Shortly after getting the new pilot, several pilots did elect to leave, but others started to fall in love with the cannon. And it wasn't all that easy overall. For instance, early on, we hadn't had the airplane less than a year. We sent, I think it was a half a dozen airplanes down to Louisiana to support an Army exercise. Unfortunately, one of the pilots apparently got what they call target fixation. They were working in pairs. One plane would dive, the other would recover. This plane would recover, the other one would dive. And so the wingman hit the target, climbed, and he saw a splash on the ground, and it turned out to be the other pilot, a fellow by the name of Don Malatesta. He'd been an excellent F-100 pilot, but the thought was that maybe he had target fixation, but it was a sad day and a sad funeral for all of us. Later on, we had another mishap. Again, the pilot survived. He was on a bombing range up at Fort Drum, and he had, I think, his left engine flamed out. He went through the shutdown procedure, and he shut down the wrong engine. So all of a sudden, he was at fairly low altitude with no engines, and he punched out. He almost committed a cardinal crime. When he came back to the base, he did not bring a bottle of whiskey to the parachute rigger. He was told the error of his ways, and I understand he corrected, but it would have been a bad scene if he hadn't. That's an old tradition in the military. Is when you have to punch out, you treat the parachute rigger. We had another one that was really kind of interesting. You mentioned Dan Peabody. We were getting ready to have an operational readiness inspection, and the regular Air Force came in on a Friday. They were dealing with the regulars who were full-time rather. On Saturday and Sunday, we weekenders would come in and complete the rest of the inspection. They decided that they wanted to see how the firehouse and the crash crew would mobilize. So they rang the bell with the sirens, and all the firemen gathered at the firehouse. The crash crews showed up, the plane captains, the people from the dispensary with the ambulance, and they were all mustered there, ready for action. At that point, a flight of 4 A-10s came back from the bombing range, and one of them banked in too tightly, approaching runway 6, and both engines flamed out. So he ejected. He was up at high altitude floating down. The plane hit just short of Route 20, bounced over the threshold fence to Bradley Field, landed on the grass, and started to smoke. The crash crew and everybody was all mustered and ready to go. They raced over there, the ambulance got the pilot. But one of the regular Air Force guys said, you know, these guys from Connecticut really like realistic training. It happened. At the outset, I mentioned that I've been somewhat persistent in my efforts to try to get a commission. I tried in the Navy, and several times during my Air Guard career, I applied for commissions, but they generally took the person who was from their work area. There was an intel job I put in for, and they had a sergeant who worked in intel, and he got the nod, so I was passed over. And that happened a couple of times, and I finally decided maybe I don't have the politics to get a commission in the Connecticut Air National Guard. Well, then we were notified that we were going to get the A-10, and they sent us the manning document, and lo and behold, it had a position called Explosive Safety Officer. So my branch officer said, Bill, you ought to try one more time. So I put in the application, and eventually I got to the selection board. And I have to mention before I get into the selection board, most of the senior NCOs in the Guard at that time were full-timers. There weren't a lot of senior weekenders such as myself. I'm talking senior master sergeant and chief master sergeant. Those are mostly full-timers. So I got to the selection board, and we went through all of the wherewithal that selection boards do. And they said, finally, the ace question, why do you want to become an Air National Guard officer? So the answer was, as a weekender, I doubt I'll ever have a chance to become a master sergeant, so I may as well try to get a commission. They liked the answer. Half the people on the board were ex-military enlisted Mustangs. They thought it was great, so I was accepted. In May of '79, I was sent off to the Academy of Military Science, or AMS, which at that time was in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was interesting because to go there, you had to be at least a staff sergeant. And they had a few people who were going to be into pilot training, and they had to get a commission before going to pilot training, and they'd only been in the Guard a short time. So they advanced them to E5, and it was incumbent upon all the rest of us in the class, there were 79 in my flight, to train these people and teach them how to be airmen. So we not only had to get through officer candidate school, but we had to train these youngsters on how to be airmen. And it was a challenge. It was fun. I went down, and under the rules that they had in those days, because of my age and because of my years of experience in a related field, I was advanced from tech sergeant to captain. And that's a heady experience to go down there as a tech sergeant and come out as a captain. I think the catch-22, however, got me. They told me it's all well and good, you're now going to be back and you're a captain and everything is dandy. However, if you're not selected for major, you have to revert to your enlisted status. So that inspired me to take squadron officer school promptly and to try my best to get good officer performance reviews. And in 1985, I was advanced to major. And then I had to take Air Command and Staff College, and my name went before the selection board in the Air Force, and they selected me for lieutenant colonel. However, I was in a major slot, so I couldn't be advanced. I thought I was going to have to retire as a major until I found that I had some good luck. They had decided that the entire maintenance and operation structure at Bradley Field was going to be restructured, and the existing commander of the maintenance squadron was tasked to go to the state headquarters, which left a vacancy. So I got a call from the state adjutant's office for air, and they said, we'd like you to take over the squadron. By the way, just for numbers, the squadron consisted of about 400 enlisted men and NCOs, and 7 officers, including 1 personnel officer. So we'd like you to take over the squadron. And so the catch is it's only for 1 year, and I knew I was heading towards retirement, but I said, it's a 1-year tour. Is that all right with you? Well, I looked at the calendar, and I noticed that a year from that month, they had a trip planned to Spangdahlem Air Force Base in Germany. My son, Bill, who, by the way, I swore into the Air Force when he graduated from ROTC. That was a heady experience. I'm standing there reading him his oath of office, trying not to cry because this is my little boy getting, he towers over me. So I said, if I go on that trip to Spangdahlem, I can visit Bill in Germany. So I said, how about 13 months instead of a year? And they thought it over, and they said, okay, you got 13 months. So they immediately advanced me to lieutenant colonel. And a year later, off we went. My request was granted, and I became commander of the squadron. And I was put in charge of the advance team that flew on a C-141 over. We stopped in the Azores and landed at Spangdahlem Air Force Base. And my son, Captain Bill Neff IV, marshaled the airplane into its parking slot and things changed. I'll tell you one little story that I thought I got a kick out of. When I was notified I'd been selected for Lieutenant Colonel, I was on a business trip down to a client in Little Rock, Arkansas. So I went to Little Rock Air Force Base, and I bought a Lieutenant Colonel's hat. Now, in the Army and in the Marine Corps, when an officer becomes major and above, he gets a hat with scrambled eggs. When in the Navy or the Coast Guard, and you become a commander, you get a hat with gold braid or scrambled eggs. The Air Force is different, and they have little clouds and little lightning bolts. So I had to get an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel's hat. Just after I was selected for Lieutenant Colonel, a memo, and I bought the hat, a memo came down from the Pentagon that this type of hat, they call this a wheel hat in the Air Force. The wheel hat was no longer a required uniform item. It would only be used, you'll see officers escorting President Obama out to the airplane and they're wearing a wheel hat. But it's only for ceremonial purposes in places like Washington. So I was never to wear my wheel hat. And to add insult to injury, I found that in the Air Force, these aren't referred to as scrambled eggs. The little clouds and the little lightning bolts, in the Air Force, this is called the hat with the farts and darts. So this is the first time that my farts and darts have ever seen the light of day. It's been sitting up in my closet since 1993. And so you have a chance to see my treasured hat. Lastly, I've mentioned that when I retired in '94, they continued to fly the A-10. However, with all the cutbacks and so forth, A-10s were taken from Connecticut, and the last flights were in 2008. They then became part of the airlift circuit, and the 103rd Tactical Fighter Wing is now the 103rd Airlift Wing. But I'll have to tell you that we in the old fighter plane community refer to these guys as trash haulers. So we're no longer mud movers, they're trash haulers. So that's the story of my odyssey from Uncle Sam's Navy to the Air National Guard. I hope that it brought you some thank you.